A single moment of recklessness crushed a life. Kyren Lacy's car roared down the road, tearing apart the safety of everything in its path. In a split second, he killed his own grandfather, a man who'd raised him, a man who'd trusted him. But that was only the beginning. As police closed in, Lacy didn't face his fate. He fled, and as the chase grew intense, so did his desperation. Minutes later, in a tragic twist, he ended his own life. A promising star turned a cautionary tale. How does a rising football player fall so far so fast? What drove him to the edge of self-destruction? This story reveals the unraveling of a young man who seemed to have it all, only to lose it all in a series of events too shocking to believe. I am True Crime Michael, and I welcome you to my channel. If you want more compelling stories like this one, be sure to like, share and subscribe to our channel. Kyren Lacy was once a rising star in the world of college football, a wide receiver for LSU with dreams of a professional career on the horizon. But in a split second, everything changed. On a fateful night, his reckless driving led to a deadly crash that took the life of his own 78-year-old grandfather, Herman Hall, a man who had raised him and placed his trust in him. It wasn't just a tragic accident, it was the beginning of a harrowing series of events. As the police closed in on him, Lacy made a fateful decision to flee the scene, triggering a high-speed chase that ended in a shocking and devastating way. In a final act of desperation, he took his own life, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. How does a young man, seemingly on top of the world, spiral into such a dark place? What drove Lacy to this breaking point? In this story, we'll take a deep dive into his life, exploring the pressures he faced, the crash that set everything in motion, and the tragic final moments that left everyone reeling. Join us as we unravel the mystery behind Kyren Lacy's tragic downfall. Kyren Lacy was a name that echoed through LSU's football program. At just 22 years old, the wide receiver was a rising star, his athletic ability catching the eyes of scouts and fans alike. His performances on the field were nothing short of exceptional. Swift, agile, and powerful, he made defenders tremble with every route he ran. During his time at LSU, Lacy amassed a series of standout performances, including a game where he caught 3 touchdowns in one night, solidifying his place as one of the top draft prospects in college football. He wasn't just a player, he was a future NFL hopeful, a bright young man with seemingly unlimited potential. But behind the spotlight, things were beginning to crumble. Lacy's rise to prominence wasn't as smooth as it appeared on the field. His personal life was fraught with complications. Raised by his grandfather, 78-year-old Herman Hall, Lacy's family dynamic was often strained. His relationship with his father, a distant figure in his life, left a void Lacy sought to fill with his football success. As much as Lacy shone on the field, off it, he carried the weight of his unresolved emotions. The pressures of fame, his strained familial bonds, and the looming expectations for his future were building, creating cracks in the seemingly perfect exterior. There were whispers about Lacy's struggles with his mental health long before that fateful night. Teammates noticed his moments of withdrawal, a stark contrast to his usual vibrant personality. He was known to spend long hours alone, sometimes retreating from the social circles that once thrived around him. His mental health, often ignored or misunderstood in the hyper-competitive world of college sports, was deteriorating. Coaches and teammates attributed his quiet moments to the typical pressures of being a young athlete. But it went deeper than that. Lacy was wrestling with something far more complex than a typical athlete's stress. His emotional well-being was eroding, and he didn't know how to ask for help, but the spotlight was still on him. With a future so bright, there seemed to be no limits to what Lacy could achieve. Yet as the story would tragically reveal, his struggles would soon collide with his career, setting off a chain of events. On that fateful night, Kyren Lacy's life, and the lives of those around him, would change forever. It began as a typical evening for the LSU wide receiver, but it quickly spiraled into chaos and tragedy. Lacy was behind the wheel of his Dodge Charger, speeding through the streets, likely unaware of just how dangerously he was driving. The car roared as he pushed it faster, his reckless behavior growing more intense with every turn. What should have been a controlled drive became a harrowing, high-speed journey that ended with devastating consequences. At 78 years old, Herman Hall had raised Lacy since he was a child. He was a guiding presence in Lacy's life, a man who offered unwavering support for his grandson's promising football career. But on that tragic evening, it was Hall who would become the unwitting victim of Lacy's rashness. Lacy, speeding down the road with little regard for the rules, collided with his grandfather. The impact of the crash was catastrophic, and Hall was killed instantly. In a moment of reckless abandon, Lacy's drive for speed had erased the life of the very man who had shaped his future. The scene was chaotic, with the sounds of screeching tires and the echoes of the deadly impact still ringing in the air. But instead of stopping to face the consequences of his actions, Lacy did the unthinkable. He fled. The very man who had once been the pride of LSU football now found himself abandoning the very family he had left behind. He didn't wait for help or even to check if his grandfather was alive. Instead, he sped away into the night, his actions marking the beginning of a desperate attempt to escape his fate. As the first responders arrived at the scene, it became clear that Lacy had left behind a trail of destruction, both physically and emotionally. The crash site was a grim reminder of the consequences of his reckless driving. But more than that, it would leave a lasting impact on the Hall family, who would never be able to understand why their beloved patriarch was taken so senselessly. The community, too, was shaken by the news, struggling to come to terms with the idea that Lacy, a once promising athlete, could be capable of such a tragic act. As the police began to piece together the events of the crash, they immediately launched a manhunt for Lacy. But the young football star was already several steps ahead, using his knowledge of the streets and his athleticism to evade the authorities. The high-speed chase that followed became the next chapter in this tragic tale. Lacy's decision to run not only further damaged his already fractured life, but it also intensified the fear and desperation surrounding his actions. The emotional toll on Lacy's family was immense. His grandfather, who had been a constant source of support, was now gone. His parents and close relatives had to contend with the heartbreaking reality of his involvement in such a tragic event. How could someone with so much potential, so much to lose, make such a devastating decision? As his family dealt with their grief, the community watched in disbelief as the police chase unfolded, unable to comprehend how a promising young man could spiral so far out of control. The weight of his actions would follow Lacy, no matter how far he ran. But in the moments after the crash, he was only focused on escaping the consequences of what he had done. The hit-and-run death of his grandfather wasn't just the end of a life, it marked the beginning of Lacy's own emotional unraveling, setting the stage for a tragic conclusion that no one could have predicted. In the coming hours as the police closed in, Lacy's actions would only grow more desperate. His decision to flee from the crash would soon turn into a manhunt, culminating in a high-speed chase that would only further cement the tragedy of that night. What had started as a reckless act of driving would quickly evolve into a series of desperate attempts to outrun the inevitable. And as the police continued to pursue him, Lacy would find himself on a path from which there would be no return. The crash wasn't just a tragic accident, it was the spark that ignited a catastrophic chain of events. The sound of sirens grew louder and louder as Kyren Lacy's reckless escape from the crash site quickly escalated into a high-stakes police pursuit. After plowing through the streets at unimaginable speeds, Lacy had no intention of facing the consequences of his actions. With his heart pounding in his chest and adrenaline coursing through his veins, Lacy pushed his Dodge Charger to its limits, weaving in and out of traffic, barely missing other vehicles. He knew that the police would catch up with him eventually, but for now he wasn't ready to give up. As the police began their chase, they quickly realized that they were dealing with someone desperate and dangerous. Lacy's driving was erratic, unpredictable, and almost reckless in its intensity. He wasn't just trying to evade capture, he was running for his life. Every move he made seemed calculated yet impulsive, as if he couldn't quite make up his mind about whether to run or give in. But with each passing second, the reality of what he had just done, killing his grandfather in the crash, was sinking in deeper. The further he ran, the more he seemed to realize that there was no way to escape his fate. The police officers involved in the chase, knowing full well the risks they were taking, pushed forward with determination. It was clear that Lacy was no longer just a young athlete. They were now chasing a man on the edge of a breakdown. They had no idea what he might do next, and every minute that passed brought with it the potential for danger, not just for Lacy, but for everyone in his path. With flashing lights illuminating the dark streets, the chase stretched on, growing more intense as Lacy's escape seemed like the only thing on his mind. The officers, though skilled and trained, faced immense risks as they tried to bring the situation to a close. At one point, Lacy made a sharp turn onto a narrow street, sending one officer careening out of control in an attempt to follow. The high-speed pursuit was no longer just about catching a suspect, it was about survival. The tension was palpable as both the officers and Lacy grew more desperate. What had started as a routine pursuit was now a life-or-death race. For Lacy, the chase symbolized more than just an attempt to escape the police. It was a frantic escape from his own reality. He had just taken the life of his grandfather, the man who had raised him, the man who had loved him unconditionally. As he sped through the streets, Lacy must have known deep down that there was no coming back from it. His life was falling apart, piece by piece, and with each mile it felt like there was no way to outrun the emotional weight bearing down on him. The chase reached a dramatic turning point when Lacy made a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Nearing a dead-end street, his options for escape dwindled. He had nowhere to go, the flashing lights of the police grew closer, and he was running out of time. In that moment, Lacy's desperation reached its peak. His decision to flee had brought him to the edge of a cliff, both literally and metaphorically. With nowhere left to run, it was clear that Lacy was now trapped. The police were closing in on him. The moment of reckoning had arrived. In one final tragic twist, as the officers got closer, Lacy made the ultimate choice. He decided to end it all. The tension reached its boiling point as he took his own life, in a final act of desperation and despair. The police arrived too late to save him. The emotional impact of Lacy's final decision reverberated throughout the entire community. The chase, which had been filled with the anticipation of a possible resolution, now ended in an unspeakable tragedy. Lacy had gone from a promising young athlete to a tragic figure who could not escape his own inner turmoil. For his family, especially his parents and those who had loved him, the loss of Lacy was incomprehensible. They had already lost so much in the crash, and now they were forced to process the devastating reality that Lacy had chosen to end his own life, rather than face the consequences of his action. The tragedy of that night, one that had begun with a reckless crash and spiraled into a desperate chase, ended in a way that no one could have predicted. The emotional devastation was felt not just by his family, but by the officers who had tried to stop him, the community that had watched in horror, and everyone who had believed in the young man's potential. Kyren Lacy had been a star on the rise, but in the blink of an eye he had fallen from grace, taking his life and the hopes of a brighter future with him. The chase, though intense, only highlighted the inner turmoil and emotional breakdown that led to Lacy's tragic death. He ran, not just from the law, but from the mounting pressures that had been slowly crushing him. In the end, there was no escape, only the shocking and tragic conclusion to a life that had once seemed full of promise. As the high-speed chase continued, Kyren Lacy's mental state seemed to deteriorate with every passing second. His heart raced, but not from the thrill of the chase. No, this was a desperate attempt to escape from the nightmare he had just unleashed, the deadly crash that claimed the life of his grandfather, Herman Hall. The guilt, the overwhelming weight of his actions was now chasing him just as relentlessly as the police were. But there was nowhere left to hide. Lacy's driving became erratic, as though each decision made behind the wheel was both instinctual and chaotic. With no clear plan, the sharp turns, the sudden acceleration, the weaving between cars, it all showed that he wasn't just trying to evade the authorities, he was running from himself. In those final moments, Lacy wasn't just fighting to stay free, he was fighting the rising tide of shame and despair that had consumed him since that fateful crash. Police reports revealed that as the chase escalated, Lacy reached speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, pushing his car beyond its limits. Officers described the pursuit as one of the most intense they had ever been involved in. The police were concerned not just for Lacy's safety, but for the lives of others on the road. At one point, one officer radioed, "This is getting out of control, he's not stopping. We have to end this." But Lacy's desperation made it clear he wasn't thinking of anything except escaping. As the chase entered its final phase, police began to anticipate his moves, surrounding him on all sides. They knew they were getting closer, but they also knew that this was a young man at the edge of a breaking point. Lacy's mental state was deteriorating fast, and with every minute that passed, the situation grew more volatile. The officers were determined, but they also knew the danger of pursuing someone so reckless and emotionally unbalanced. Then, in a moment that shattered the tension, it happened. At the end of a long stretch of road, Lacy's car slammed into a guardrail, coming to an abrupt stop. For a brief moment, there was silence. The chase had ended, but the final chapter was about to unfold. As officers approached the vehicle, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Lacy was inside, but he wasn't surrendering. Instead, in a final act of desperation, he took his own life. The reports later confirmed that Lacy had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It was a tragic, shocking end to a life that had seemed to be on the verge of greatness just days before. The officers who arrived at the scene were left to process the horror of what had just unfolded. They had chased him down, but in the end, they couldn't save him from himself. No one was prepared for the final turn this story would take. They had seen the speeding, the evasiveness, but no one expected the end to come in such a heartbreaking way. For Lacy, the pressure had become too much. His mental health struggles, the crushing guilt over the crash that killed his grandfather, and the overwhelming shame of running from the law all converged in a moment of finality. His death wasn't just an end to the chase, it was the tragic conclusion of a young man's battle with his inner demons. The community, the police, and his family were left in shock. What could have been done to prevent this? Was there any way to have reached Lacy before he spiraled too far? Those questions would haunt them in the days that followed. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of a promising athlete. It was the loss of a young man who could have had so much more had he only been able to overcome the emotional pain that had consumed him. As the final moments of Kyren Lacy's life played out, the damage was done. His story was no longer just about a talented football player. It was a warning about the fragility of mental health, especially in the high-pressure world of sport. The tragedy that ended his life left everyone asking how someone so promising could fall so far. The legal aftermath of Kyren Lacy's tragic actions began the moment his grandfather, Herman Hall, was killed in the crash. Lacy was immediately facing a slew of charges, including reckless driving, felony hit-and-run, and negligent homicide. The legal system would have certainly held him accountable for the death of his grandfather. As the authorities pieced together the events, Lacy was set to face a court of law where his future as an athlete and as a person seemed to be on the line. He was no longer the promising LSU star, he was now a criminal. His recklessness had not only cost him a potential career in professional football, but it had also cost his grandfather his life. But with Lacy's death, the legal proceedings came to a halt. The haunting reality of the situation was that he never had to face the consequences of his actions. His self-inflicted death was a tragic end, not only for his family, but also for the community and anyone who had believed in his bright future. The case left behind countless unanswered questions. What could have been done to help Lacy? Could someone have intervened to prevent his mental health struggles from spiraling out of control? The emotional toll on Lacy's family was unimaginable. For his parents, the grief of losing their son was compounded by the fact that he had been the one responsible for taking the life of his grandfather. The Hall family, who had suffered the loss of a beloved patriarch, were left with the additional heartbreak of knowing that Lacy's actions directly led to the death of the man who had raised him. Their lives were forever changed by one tragic, reckless moment. Lacy's teammates and coaches also felt the devastating impact of the events. The young man they had supported, trained with, and cheered for was now gone. Not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. Teammates who had looked up to Lacy now found themselves grappling with the fact that someone they had once admired had succumbed to the pressures and struggles they never truly understood. Coaches who had once seen him as a future star were left wondering if there was more they could have done to support him during his mental health battles. Lacy's story also sparked widespread discussions about mental health in the world of sports. While athletes are often expected to perform under immense pressure, the mental toll can be just as heavy as the physical. Lacy's case brought attention to the fact that mental health issues, especially in athletes, are often overlooked or dismissed. His breakdown didn't happen overnight. It was the result of mounting emotional struggles that went unnoticed by many. The tragedy highlighted a critical gap in how sports organizations approach the mental well-being of their players, especially those under the intense scrutiny of being a rising star. As the community and his family struggled with the aftermath of Lacy's actions, it became clear that his story was more than just about a promising football player who lost everything. It was a somber reminder of the importance of mental health and the devastating consequences that can arise when it is neglected. The tragedy of Kyren Lacy's life and death left everyone involved questioning what more could have been done to prevent such a heartbreaking outcome. The legal system had no chance to deliver justice, but the emotional toll of Lacy's actions continued to reverberate through the lives of everyone affected. The Hall family had lost their loved one in the most senseless way possible, while Lacy's family would never fully heal from the dual loss of both a grandfather and a son. As the community mourned, the tragedy remained a stark reminder that in the world of elite sports, mental health struggles are often the invisible battle that can destroy even the brightest future. Kyren Lacy's tragic story is a stark reminder of how quickly a life can unravel, even when it appears to be on the brink of greatness. From the promise of a successful football career to the senseless crash that claimed the life of his grandfather, Lacy's journey was marked by both talent and turmoil. His final moments marked by a desperate police chase and a tragic suicide left behind an ocean of grief, unanswered questions, and an immense emotional toll on everyone who knew him. Lacy's actions, from the fatal hit-and-run to his flight from justice, are a tragic illustration of the destructive power of untreated mental health issues, especially in high-pressure environments like college sports. His story highlights the need for better mental health support for athletes, who often face unimaginable pressure to perform and succeed. For his family, the emotional devastation was overwhelming. Losing a beloved patriarch in the crash and then, just days later, facing the heartbreaking loss of their son was a grief no one should ever have to endure. The Hall family, along with Lacy's own parents, were left in the wake of this preventable tragedy. The community that once admired Lacy now had to grapple with the reality of his downfall, and the question remains, could someone have intervened to prevent this devastating end? This story doesn't just serve as a warning about reckless behavior, it underscores the importance of mental health awareness, the fragility of life, and the destructive consequences of ignoring inner struggles. If you've been moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Michael. Join us for more thought-provoking investigations into the darkest corners of the human psyche.